Hi, I want to take a few minutes today to introduce this year's theme and the first set of readings we're sending home with you to look over in the week ahead. The theme is Meeting St. Augustine. We chose this theme because, as you know, after Pope Francis died, the College of Cardinals elected the first ever American-born Pope, Robert Prevost from Chicago, who took the name Leo XIV. Pope Leo is an Augustinian friar, and he quotes St. Augustine in easily more than half of his homilies and speeches. So, as we here in the U.S. celebrate our first pope and learn more about who Leo is and what his approach is, Father Ryan and I have decided to dedicate this year's DSG to getting to know the saint who has formed Pope Leo into who he is now more than any other. And it's not only Pope Leo. St. Augustine of Hippo is hands down one of the three most influential theologians in all of Christian history. Not just Catholic history, Christian history. The others are St. Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval Dominican and professor, and St. Paul, who was literally inspired by God in his New Testament writings. But St. Paul already has hundreds of Bible studies devoted to him that anyone can find very easily. And St. Thomas is really a tough nut to crack for people who aren't already used to medieval philosophy in literary forms. St. Augustine is for everyone. He wrote an extraordinary amount of sermons, letters, and treatises, and yet it's much harder to find a simple series that explores his most important writings and ideas at an introductory lay level. That's what my intention is for all of you in putting this year's program together. Next week, my start of the session video will be an introduction to St. Augustine's biography and his cultural setting. Today, I just want to walk you through our calendar of topics for the year ahead, and then set up the short readings you're about to receive. We'll spend the fall semester walking through the first 35 or so years of Augustine's life, up to his baptism and his full entry into the Christian life. Because, as you may already know, Augustine was raised by a Christian mother, but for various reasons refused to become a Christian himself for many years, and spent his teens and 20s pursuing worldly ambition and lust. He tells his own story of those years of sin and God's work to bring him back to himself in his most famous book, Confessions, which is one of the world's first autobiographies, and certainly the most widely influential and imitated one. We're not going to read big chunks of Confessions directly because it's actually a much harder book than it looks at first. Instead, we'll look at individual episodes from Confessions and from Augustine's life story in chronological order. And usually I'll pair that excerpt from Confessions with another excerpt from one of the saint's later writings on the same topic, the same spiritual issue that he was working through early in life that he then taught about in his sermons or other writings later in life. Along the way, we'll meet Augustine's family members, especially his almost equally famous mother, St. Monica, his friends, his teachers, and the false religions and philosophies he experimented with on his way to true Christianity. That'll take us through the fall and up to our Christmas break. Then in the new year, we'll do some thematic looks at the kinds of topics Augustine wrote and preached about as a bishop. We'll give January to the practical ways Augustine treated and worked with his flock in the African town of Hippo, how he preached to them, how he instructed converts to Christianity, and how he wanted clergy and laity to think of each other and treat each other properly. In February, we'll fly higher and look at two of Augustine's loftiest theological treatments: how to rightly understand the Genesis account of a six-day creation, and what it means for humans to be made in the image of God when we consider God as a Trinity. As abstract and philosophical as those sound, we're going to see in those sessions that Augustine was perhaps history's greatest psychologist. Throughout his life, he wrestled with the question of what it truly means to be human. And in these topics, he discovered some fundamental and life-changing answers. In March, we'll look at the two most pervasive heresies that he felt he needed to combat as a bishop. The Donatists, who had gone into schism over the question of whether men who were less than perfect models of integrity could still validly serve as clergy. Their answer was no. And the Pelagians, who argued that humans could keep the Ten Commandments and God's other moral laws by their natural force of will, with no necessary need for God's grace to make it possible. Here we'll see two of Augustine's most famous and also most infamous contributions to Christian theology, the doctrines of the sacraments and original sin. Finally, in April, we'll come to the last years of Augustine's life and what his world was like as he died. We'll look at his thoughts on death and the legacy of church unity that he desperately wanted to leave behind for his people. All of that is coming soon to a DSG near you. Now for next week, I want to give you a taste of Augustine's writing style, and particularly the profoundly prayerful nature of his writing. One of the reasons we're not reading his most famous book, Confessions, together as a group, is because it's remarkably hard to get started with, much harder than people think when they hear it's an autobiography. From first page to last, Confessions is written as a plea to God to help Augustine as he grapples with his own past and his sense of himself, who he is as a sinner and as a recipient of so much undeserved mercy from God. The book is, at bottom, one long prayer. Perhaps later I'll make a sidebar video for you about the book Confessions itself and how to get started with it if you want to take the plunge. For now, I'm just giving you 5 brief examples, each less than 1 page, of the prayerful style of Confessions. 2 of them come from Book 1, as Augustine opens his prayer to God and invokes God's aid to help him review his life through God's eyes. The other 3 come from Book 10, when Augustine has finished his conversion story and is now reflecting on who he has become, how his memories of his past are still a defining part of him, even after he left that sinful past behind, and how much loving God he has to make up for. You'll find in these prayers probably Augustine's 2 most famous sentences out of all the hundreds of things he ever wrote. You'll probably recognize them immediately, so I'm not going to tell you what they are in advance. You'll just have to find them yourselves, and I really think you will very quickly. So here's your assignment for this week, if you want to think of it that way. Read these 5 prayers. Pick 2, 3 of them at most, that take hold of your mind particularly, and pray them to God for yourself in the days ahead. When we come back next week, you'll converse together about these prayers twice. Once at the beginning, to share how you experienced the prayers in the past week of your lives, and again after you watch my video introducing you to the life of St. Augustine, to take a fresh look at the prayers and see what they reveal about their author, or even about their relevance to you that you hadn't picked up on before. Until then, go in peace, and may the Holy Spirit move you through St. Augustine's prayers this week. Peace and all good.